that. And desktop history, Cold War. So right now I'm uploading a new PowerPoint into the files section on Canvas. Do that. There we go. How you doing? Good. All right. All right, here we are. So, how many of you know what the Cold War is? Well, a handful of you, that's good. Tell me briefly what you know about it. Anybody? Yeah, Elijah? Right. It's a war between the United States and the Soviet Union, aka Russia, but it's not like a World War II war. It's more of a competition, we'll say, than it is a formal war where they're having battles with each other. So the famous question is, if you want to really quickly test if somebody knows their history, is you ask them how many people died in the Cold War, right? And the answer is 0, because there were no battles. Now, technically, of course, people died during the years that the Cold War happened. It was 45 years long, right? But in terms of battles, if you said how many people died in battles in the Cold War, well, there were none, so nobody died in battles in the Cold War. Now, there were wars that happened within the Cold War. So, for example, the Korean War, okay, happened in the early part of the Cold War. The Vietnam War that America got involved in happened during the Cold War, right? So there were some wars that happened during the Cold War that actually did involve battles and deaths and things like that, if we're being technical, right? Hello, come on in, have a seat. If you're really scared about contracting COVID, you can set those little screen things up there if you like. No problem with me. I just didn't do it. So, the Cold War basically starts the minute that World War II ends. Now, if you recall in World War II, you guys remember who was on the Allied side, the Allied powers? Who was on the Allied powers? Just yell them out. Russia, US, Britain, right? Russia, USA, Britain. Or Soviet Union is the other name for Russia. These two flags up here, American flag and Soviet Union flag. Russia's flag doesn't look like that anymore because they are technically not communist anymore. Although they are still more or less a dictatorship under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, who I actually just read last week, just recently signed a bill into law that allows him to hold another 2 terms as the president of Russia. He has already overextended himself by, I don't even know how many terms now. I think he first got elected in 1998. So Vladimir Putin has been basically running Russia since I was in 8th grade and is still in power today, which is pretty crazy to think about, right? All right, very good. Well, so after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, who had together defeated fascism and Nazism in Europe, immediately find themselves on opposing sides of one another after the war. And this is in part due to the fact that they have such different styles of, governance, but also economies and so on. They have very different way of doing things. As you guys learned about back in the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union was taken over by the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution, right? The communists. Vladimir Lenin took over at first, then he died, and then it went to Joseph Stalin. And when World War II ends, Joseph Stalin is still the premier of the Soviet Union, the top communist dictator, totalitarian ruler of Russia. All right? Let's talk about their experiences in World War II. Take a look at this. The United States, we lost under 400,000 people in the war. Less than 500,000, okay? Less than 500,000. Russia lost 50 times as many people. They lost nearly 25 million people in the war, okay? No American cities were destroyed in World War II because there were no battles here in America. We were on the other side of the ocean. The only American city, quote unquote, that was bombed was Pearl Harbor, and that's not really a city, it was a port, and it wasn't even technically in a U.S. state because Hawaii doesn't become a state until, I think, 1958 or something like that. So no American cities were bombed during the war. Many Soviet cities are not only destroyed, they're just wiped off the face of the earth. They're not just like, oh, some buildings fell down and we're going to rebuild them. They just don't exist anymore. Okay? The United States has a capitalist economy. Capitalism, free market, right? People get to go out, buy stuff. You go out, you can buy land, you can build yourself a house. You can buy all sorts of consumer goods, right? America, capitalist in nature. Russia has a communist command economy where everything is run by the state. There is no private sphere in Russia. There's no private property. There's no private ownership. There's no private businesses. Everything is run by the state, okay? And then America has a democratic government where we use voting to choose who our leaders are. And then Russia has a totalitarian government where there is no freedom of choice. And instead, they have a communist dictator in power who holds absolute authority over everything and who regularly kills his own people by sending them off to gulags and so on and so forth. Okay? Purges and all that stuff. We learned about purges during the Russian Revolution in the early days of Joseph Stalin, where he would just take people who he even just suspected were against him and send them away to the gulags to chop down trees until they die in Siberia. Okay? As you can see, there's a lot of differences here between the United States and Russia. Okay? And these differences, because the United States and Russia after World War II emerge as the two global superpowers, they immediately enter into a competition with one another over who is going to have more influence in the post-World War II era. All right? So, they start to face off against one another. Their goals for the newly liberated Europe, liberated meaning getting rid of Nazism and fascism in Europe, Their goals for rebuilding Europe are completely different. The United States wants to encourage the spread of democracy, because if there are more democratic states, the United States can build alliances with those states, offer those states financial aid, and have a whole lot of pro-democratic nations on its side. The USSR, the Soviet Union, wants to spread communism, because the more places that are communist, the more allies it will have. So there's this immediate competition in rebuilding Europe to rebuild these nations who had been taken over by, say, the Nazis or whoever, and turn them into the type of government that either the United States or Soviet Union wants to see more of. And so you might remember, if we take a look at a map here real quick, let's just take a look at Google Maps real quickly here. All right, here is Russia. You guys see, well, let me do this real quick. Okay, here's Russia. It's pretty darn big. You see that on the screen there? Russia, all right? Here is Germany over here. Russia, if you'll recall, was pushing forward after the Battle of Stalingrad, which is down here somewhere, okay? They were pushing forward for years until they finally pushed the German army all the way back to Germany. But in the process, they occupied a bunch of these nations here in Eastern Europe, including down here in the Balkans, Romania, Hungary, Serbia, and then even Czechoslovakia, Poland, and then the Baltic states up here, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and so on. So a lot of Eastern Europe, by the time that World War II ends, Eastern Europe is occupied by the Soviet Union, meaning there are Soviet troops in all of those places. One of the things I told you about with the Yalta Conference before Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, the last major meeting of the Big Three, just a month or so before he died, Stalin had promised to liberate, in other words, remove his Soviet troops from those areas and allow free elections there. But then when he met with Truman at the Potsdam Conference, he took back what he said, and he said, I'm not going to remove my troops from those areas because there's an old school phrase, I probably told you this before, but I repeat myself a million times, so just hear me out. You ever heard this phrase? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. You ever heard that before? Maybe from me? If you've never heard that before, I want you to think about what that means. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, now it's my fault because you already fooled me once and I believed you a second time, right? All right. Germany has now attacked Russia twice inside of 20 years, okay? The Russians' opinion of Germany is that they are a major threat. And so the reason that they want to occupy these territories here, not only to expand their own control in Europe, is also to prevent another German attack on Russia. They want to build what's called a buffer zone, kind of like a bumper on the front or back of your car, okay? You build in a little bit of padding to prevent another onslaught from the Germans. Russia has zero faith that Germany will remain peaceful after World War II. And the last thing that they want to see happen is their nation invaded for a third time. So this is one of the reasons that the Russians are going to be so adamant about maintaining a military presence in all of those Eastern European nations there, even though those nations should technically be free nations and not occupied by any other forces. Okay? So, let's talk a little bit about some of their goals. Okay, the United States wants to also gain access to raw materials in these places. Much of Europe after World War II is utterly destroyed. Particularly cities like Berlin, London is in a real bad shape. There's a lot of other cities too that have undergone tremendous damage. And the United States is hoping to rebuild Europe and to create new markets there. The United States comes out of World War II relatively unscathed. Our economy is doing well. We have fully recovered from the Great Depression by that point. You guys might remember learning about the Great Depression when the stock market crashed in 1929. By the time that we get to 1945, the stock market has recovered, the United States economy has recovered, and because we didn't have that much damage in the war, we were hoping to be able to go over to Europe and start rebuilding it. And the idea was, if we rebuild Europe and contribute our own money and our own resources and so on to rebuilding Europe, this will foster beneficial trade relationships so that these nations that we help rebuild will continue to remain loyal to the United States and friendly to the United States and trading partners with the United States. What's up, Gareth? Okay. Okay, you got it. Grab a seat. All right. The other thing is that the United States generally, do you guys remember end of World War I? What was the document that sealed the fate of Germany after World War I? The Treaty of Versailles. Exactly. What did the Treaty of Versailles do? Exactly. How did the Germans respond to that? Precisely. Okay. What happened when we tried to punish Germany is they got angry and they ended up rebuilding a force and starting a Second World War. The United States says, don't be stupid. We don't want to do that again. We don't want to punish Germany to the point where they get angry and start trying to rebuild their military and wage a Third World War. So our goal for Germany is that we want to reunite Germany, we want to stabilize Germany, and we want to make Germany into a regular part of everyday European affairs and global trade. We don't want Germany getting mad again, right? The Russians are like, you've got to be nuts. Why would you ever want to reunite Germany, the nation that just went and waged the deadliest war in human history, and you're saying you want them to, what, become stable and strong again? You've got to be out of your minds. So the Russians and the United States have very different opinions about Germany. Also, because the Soviet Union had been so destroyed during the war, okay, they don't care about the rest of Europe. Their nation is suffering. They lost 25 million people in the war, okay? That's an obscene amount of people. It's probably about 3 or 4 times the size of the entire population of greater Los Angeles, okay? It's huge. The numbers of losses were tremendous. They don't care about the rest of Europe. They care about rebuilding themselves. So, they would rather take materials from these lands that they were occupying in Eastern Europe and then use those materials to rebuild the Soviet Union back to what it was before the war started. So all of these differences, okay, paint a picture that is going to mean that these two global superpowers are going to really have strong variances in what they want to have happen after the war. What's up, man? Looks like you're stuck with the one closest to me. Sorry about that. All right. Any questions about this so far? What did they do to Germany? What did who do to Germany? Both of them? So we're going to talk about that. They divided up into 4 sections. We'll get to that in just a couple minutes here. After the war? Yeah, I know. But yeah, we'll get to it. Trust me. I'm just not quite there yet. But your question will be answered. All right. So the Red Scare. The United States, going back to the 1920s, really, really hated communism. There was once upon a time here in the United States, if you were labeled a communist, okay, it was pretty much the worst thing that could happen to you. I mean, there were movie stars, musicians, performers, etc., that they were blacklisted after having quote-unquote communist ties, and they couldn't get gigs anymore, they couldn't make movies anymore, etc., etc. Okay? Being labeled a communist in the United States was dangerous because of the very severe feelings that people had about the dangers of communism. There's this overwhelming fear of communist world takeover, particularly in the West, in America and in Britain. And this started actually all the way back in the 1920s, just after the Russian Revolution. When the Russian Revolution first happened, I don't know if you remember anything about learning about Karl Marx. Karl Marx, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, he basically said that when a nation turns to communism, that it will not stop. The communist revolution will start spreading, and it will ignore borders, and there will be a worldwide communist revolution that spreads everywhere. And a lot of people were really freaked out by that because they didn't want to see their lives change here in America, where it was democratic and capitalist. They didn't want to see communism take over here. So there's a lot of fears about the spread of communism. So back in the 1920s, there was this whole thing of the Red Scare. People were terrified of communism. There was a lot of anti-Soviet Union propaganda. And then we enter into World War II, and all of the propaganda changes to sway people's opinion about Russia back to being more positive. Oh, the Russians, they're our friends now. Good old Uncle Joe Stalin, right? So all of this was really kind of confusing because what do we believe? Is communism bad? Is the Soviet Union bad or good? Or is Joseph Stalin good or bad? Generally speaking, he's bad. So after the war, all of that propaganda switches back to being anti-communist in nature because now they're the bigger threat. All right? So they put all of this Red Scare rhetoric and propaganda on hold. They paused it during World War II, but now that the war is over, they resume all of that anti-communist propaganda, and it continues when the Soviet Union becomes a superpower after World War II. So after the war, the two leaders of the United States are, on the left, U.S. President Harry Truman, and on the right, the USSR Premier Joseph Stalin. Also, you might remember that one of the big talking points of several of these conferences that they held towards the end of the war was that they were going to create a brand new international organization for keeping peace, peacekeeping organization. And this became known as the UN, the United Nations. You guys know where the UN headquarters is? What? Nope, not in Russia. Good guess, though. Good guess. It's not Washington, D.C. either. It is in New York. How'd you know that? You guessed? Yeah. Oh, that's a good guess. New York City is where the UN headquarters is. Nice job. All right. So the UN headquarters is situated in New York City, and in June of 1945, the first 50 countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union, joined the United Nations. All right? What is the United Nations? Let's just talk about it really quickly. It's a big building where diplomats, okay, foreign representatives, come to a large chamber, and you'll have, let's say, if this was the UN, you'd have different people representing different nations. So maybe somebody would be Britain, somebody would be France, somebody would be Soviet Union, et cetera, okay? Say it one more time. It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure how many times a year they meet, to be honest with you. Probably many. Yeah, so what they do is they come together and they vote on collectively understood resolutions to issues. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about how the United Nations functions here, which is fine. Let's just talk about that. So the UN is a somewhat democratic organization. People come together and they vote, okay, on resolutions. Now, the way the UN works is you have the general members, okay, the general member nations of the United Nations. At any given time, you have what's known as the Security Council, which is made up of 11 members, okay? You guys following me on this? Am I boring you to tears? Hear me out, because this is good stuff for you guys to know. All right, United Nations. Today, do you guys know how many, hello there. I'm low on chairs, but you can grab one over from the back over there, or you can sit at this one here if you like. So, the United Nations. Do you guys know how many nations are in the UN today? It's like 192 or something like that. There's a lot, okay? And of that 192 member nations of the UN, at any given time, 11 of them hold the role of what's called Security Council. Security Council, all right? Of that 11 on the Security Council, 5 of them are permanent members of the Security Council, okay? Those are the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. Those are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council on the United Nations. The other 6 of the 11 rotate. So sometimes it'll be smaller nations, other times it'll be bigger nations, but the other 6 of the Security Council rotate in and out, okay? 5 are permanent, 6 rotate. That's how they decided to do it. Why is this significant? Because, what? Yeah, I'm about to get to that. So, the Security Council holds veto power, basically, all right? The 5 permanent members of the Security Council can, any one of them, veto any resolution that gets passed. This is significant, and it's going to play into our story in the Cold War a little bit, because one of the things that's going to become evident is this. Think about this for a second. The United States, democratic, capitalist. The Soviet Union, communist. Command economy, totalitarian, all right? If a resolution gets passed that the United States favors, what's the Soviet Union going to do? They're going to veto it, okay? If something gets passed that's favorable to the Soviet Union, what's the United States going to do? They're going to veto it, which means how are any resolutions going to get passed during the Cold War when the 2 biggest superpowers on the planet each have veto power over one another? It's going to make it really difficult to pass resolutions that interfere with Cold War conflicts, okay? That will come up in our story again in a little bit here. So the Soviets wanted to shield themselves from further Western invasions. There's a deep-seated mistrust or distrust of the West, in particular Germany, but also Britain, France, and others, after the war ends. And so at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union occupied much of Eastern Europe with its military. Stalin completely ignored the Yalta Agreement to keep those nations free. And instead, he uses the opportunity to install communist governments in Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, and Yugoslavia. Okay? This is bad because now immediately half of Europe is under communist rule. They do not have a choice about it because the Russians are using their military to force this upon these nations who would have absolutely no ability to defend themselves against the giant superpower of the Soviet Union. What is Albania going to do when the Soviet Union comes over and says, you're going to go communist? Are they going to revolt? Sure, they could, but then the Soviet military would crush the revolt and install the communist government anyway. Okay, so there's very little hope for these nations in terms of getting the Soviet Union out of them and having them turn democratic. So if we were to take a look at the map of Europe after World War II, it looks something like this. All of those areas in red, okay, communist after World War II, thanks to the Soviet Union. All right? This is really scary to nations of the West, like France, Britain, United States, Canada, etc. They don't like this because it seems that that prediction Marx made about communism spreading everywhere is starting to come true. The last thing that they want to see happen is communism spread even beyond those regions into other areas of the globe. But it is going to do that whether they like it or not. So the United States tries to contain the spread of communism. This policy gets known as, you guessed it, containment. Okay? They try to stop the spread of communism by containing it in the places where it already exists. All right? Truman's foreign policy was all about containment from 1946 to 47. He was aiming to stop communism expansion and block the Soviet Union's influence in areas that aren't its own lands. They also, the United States, tried to form stronger alliances with weak countries that could then resist Soviet influence. Europe had become very divided, and it was very, very weak after World War II because of all the devastation. Germany is split into two major sections, but even those two major sections are further subdivided. Basically, West Germany and East Germany. All right, let's take a look at a map of this really quickly here. This is kind of tricky to explain. Drawn this a million times, but I'll draw it again. All right, check this out. Sorry, you guys are going to have a hard time seeing this because it's not going to pop up on that one over there. Let's see here. We need this. All right. So, let's say, and I'm going to simplify the drawing here a little bit, okay? Let's say this is Germany. Okay, that's Germany. After the war, they take Germany and they divide it actually into four sections. 4 occupied zones is what they were called, okay? Meaning that the militaries of 4 different places were occupying regions in Germany. You had the U.S. zone, you had the British zone, you had the French zone, and then you had the Soviet Union zone. Now, this is very oversimplified. Okay, you'll see what it actually looks like on the map in just a second, but let's just use this for the sake of simplicity. Berlin, when Germany was a unified nation prior to the start of World War II, Berlin was the capital city, right? Berlin, capital city of Germany, big, important city, bombed to smithereens by the Americans and the British at the end of the war. Berlin is a heap of rubble at the end of World War II. But Berlin happens to fall within the Soviet Union sector, all right? So this is the capital, Berlin right here, okay? Berlin is the most important city in Germany because it was the capital and also hugely populous and whatever. If we take this, let's see here, how does this work? Something like that, and we blow this up and we look at Berlin. They took Berlin and they also divided Berlin into 4 zones. All right? So you have Berlin in the Soviet sector. This is the entire Soviet sector right here. Okay? But Berlin also is divided into 4 zones. We have the US, UK, USSR, and France. Thank you. All right? You following me so far? Great. Okay. Early on, the United States, the UK, and France decide we want to reunite Germany, turn it all into one place again. The Soviet Union, though, says no. Okay, we are going to continue to occupy East Germany for as long as we want, until we're ready to give it up, which is going to be never, by the way. All right? When I was born, which is a million years ago in 1983, Germany was still 2 nations, West Germany and East Germany. Okay? They don't become reunified until I was about 6 years old, around 1989 or so. Okay? I want you to consider that for a second, because that means that going all the way back to 1945, there were 2 Germanys until 1989. Okay? 2 Germanys, going all the way back to the end of World War II. That's about 45 years, roughly. All right? Long time. Long time. Even to this day, in 2021, how many years is that? 32 years later? 32 years later, East Germany, even to this day, is lagging behind in development compared to the rest of West Germany. All right? There are still social and economic differences between the part of Germany that remained under Soviet control for 45 years after the end of World War II. All right? So this has long-term impacts on what ends up happening to Germany. But let's take a look at the map here so you can get a better... Oops, let me do this real quick. So here's what it actually looks like. All right? So you can see here, the green section is the British section, the blue section is the French section, the yellow section is the American section, and the red section is the Soviet section of Germany. So this is how they end up dividing Germany into 4 zones, each of them occupied by the militaries of the respective nations that are in those areas. And originally the country was divided into 4 sections, but by 1949, just 3 years after the end of World War II, the 3 democratic nations, Britain, France, and the United States, combined their areas into what became West Germany. So each of these areas here, all right, let's do this again real quickly. And let's use blue, I guess. Each of these regions right here get combined into West Germany. This whole section right here becomes West Germany. This remains East Germany. Okay. Here is Berlin. Okay, so like I said, you can see how Berlin as a city is also divided into different sections. Okay? All good? You guys are so quiet. Weird. What's up, Elijah? In the what now? Oh, you know, these 2 areas up here, I'm not 100% sure what those are. Yeah, well, they're U.S., I don't know. I think that, remember, this was only the first 3 years after World War II ended. I don't know, maybe the British needed extra assistance in these areas here because they were cities or something like that. I'm not really sure. That might be Bonn, B-O-N-N. I'm not really 100% sure on that. Yeah?
Now you said Soviet Union took over the islands.
Yes.
So
Some of them more than others. Yeah, more or less. Some of them. Why? What's like the question? Oh, you mean the Soviet Union was destroyed? Yeah, but it's mostly about the size, and you're absolutely right. The Soviet Union was destroyed largely during the war, but they still had a massive military. I mean, we're talking millions and millions and millions of troops. Still stronger than the Eastern European nations. Not stronger than maybe Britain or America, but like for those Eastern European nations that really didn't have a whole, like Poland, Poland's not going to be able to resist the Soviet Union's power. So, okay, let me clear this off the screen one more time. Because, well, there's still a lot of civilian people that live there. They're homeless. They're starving. It was a huge commercial center. It's not easy to just get rid of a capital, basically. It was the capital. I mean, it was the capital of Germany, and it was the most populous city in Germany. It was considered the heart of German politics. It was just important. It was an important place, and that's why they divided it also into 4 different zones. To this day, you can they do rebuild Berlin. You can go to Berlin today. It's probably one of the most modern-looking cities in Europe because they had to rebuild the whole thing after World War II. So a lot of the buildings in Germany were completely reconstructed from the ground up after 1945. Very few buildings in Germany still standing, or in Berlin rather, are still standing from hundreds of years ago, like in other European cities. All right, so here you can see kind of what it looks like on a little bit larger map that contains other neighboring places here. But that's essentially kind of the layout for the German borders of West and East Germany, and then Berlin, which is still occupied by 4 different nations. Now, here's the thing. Because Berlin rests squarely in the Soviet sector, all right? Oh, we ran out of time. We'll continue this conversation this afternoon, folks. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Are those boots comfortable?
Very comfortable.
Yeah.
$40 on Amazon.
Question, right?
Hello.
Are you able to unlock like my student account?
Unlock your student account,
Yeah.
like